to give the impression that I dismiss the process which has been started at the meeting between foreign secretaries as being of no account at all. I think it's a very small start. And if I may draw the analogy of arms reduction agreements, you may recall that the test ban treaty began from a very small and indistinct beginning. Similarly, the arrangements that are now going on to control flows of conventional arms with the Wassenaar arrangement have been of such small account that people say, is it worth bothering with this, or should we not have devoted such an enormous amount of energy to what is a comparatively trivial result? Well, I don't think that. I think you have a building in which the first brick has been made, and there's an awful lot of superstructure still to come, and there will be setbacks on the way, as there was a setback, I think, when the Indian Foreign Secretary gave his interpretation of the clause, which is of greatest importance to most of the people in this room, and I would imagine to the vast majority of citizens of Pakistan and to many of the people beyond in the wider community of the world. Let's not be disheartened by that. Let's decide that we're going to try and make this work, and let us propose confidence-building measures that we think would be effective. Let us talk about the reduction of troops. Let us talk about the ending of human rights violations. Let us talk about the trials being held in public. And if we do that, and we convince the international community, then I think that in the long run, we shall prevail. And I know my confidence in that is justified, because I see the immense force.
आज का ये जलसा हमारे मेहमान बरतानिया के पार्लियामेंट के मेंबर लॉर्ड एरिक एवबरी के एजाज में मुनक्किद किया जा रहा है। आज के इस जलसा की सदारत सरदार नवाज खान एडवोकेट सदर जम्मू कश्मीर पीपल्स पार्टी बाहर से तशरीफ लाए हुए हैं, जो इंसानी हुकूक के हवाले से ग्रां कदर खदमात सरअंजाम दे रहे हैं। आज के इस जलसा के होस्ट मेजबान जनाब सरदार खालिद इब्राहिम खान सदर जम्मू कश्मीर पीपल्स पार्टी, जिनकी दावत से हमारे ये मोहसिन लॉर्ड एवबरी अपनी इस तकरीबन 2 दहाई पे मुश्तमिल इंसान अंजाम दी। और मैं ये कहूंगा कि इन्होंने ऐसी खिदमात सर अंजाम दी जो कोई कश्मीरी भी जैसे ये इस कदर मुतासर हैं। हमारे गाजी मिल्लत सरदार मोहम्मद इब्राहिम खान की तारीख के हवाले से इस कदर मुतासर हैं कि इन्होंने अपने इस मुख्तसर दौरा में आज़ाद कश्मीर के किसी दूसरे जिले का इंतखाब नहीं किया, बल्कि आप शोदा और गाजियों की इस धरती पे ये आप लोगों से मुखातब होने के लिए यहाँ पे तशरीफ लाए हैं। इससे कबल कि मैं उनको खिताब की दावत दूं, मैं
every nook and corner of the world he has visited United Nations to sort of advocate our cause in that August forum. He has visited different August forums throughout the world and advocated our cause. It is today we have invited him here at Rawalakot to pay him tribute to his contribution which he has made to this just cause and righteous cause. So we welcome Lord Avebury to this to Punch particularly, and in general to Azad Kashmir and Pakistan. I would say a few words in Urdu, and then I'll hand over this rostrum to Lord Avebury. मेरे दोस्तों, क्योंकि चंद बातें मैं आपसे उर्दू में भी करना चाहूँगा। लॉर्ड एवबरी जो हैं वो, जैसा कि मैंने चंद अल्फाज उनकी तारीफ में कहे हैं, उन्होंने बड़ी कुर्बानी, मैं कुर्बानी इसलिए कहूँगा कि इस उम्र में, आज जबकि उनकी उम्र 70 साल से ज़्यादा है और वो हार्ट पेशेंट भी हैं, वो दिल के मरीज भी हैं, और आज से 2 साल पहले जब उन्होंने रावलाकोट आना था तो वो उस वक्त यहाँ नहीं आ सके दिसंबर 1975 में, क्योंकि उस वक्त वो अचानक बीमार हुए اور ان کا اس وقت جو ہے دل کا آپریشن ہوا جس وجہ سے وہ یہاں تشریف نہیں لا سکے. ہم نے ان کو دوبارہ یہ دعوت دی اور انہوں نے یہ دعوت بڑی خوشی سے قبول کی کہ جناب میں جب بھی آپ چاہیں گے, جب میں صحت یاب ہوں گا تو میں دوبارہ راولاکوٹ کے عوام کے سامنے اور خصوصاً راولاکوٹ اور پھر بلب پنچ کے عوام کے سامنے اور سارے آزاد کشمیر کے عوام کے سامنے جاؤں گا اور کشمیر کے حوالے سے ان سے بات کروں گا. تو کیونکہ بجلی چلی گئی ہے اور میرا خیال ہے میری آواز تو آپ تک ہو سکتا ہے پہنچ رہی ہو, لیکن لارڈ ایوبری کی آواز ہو سکتا ہے آپ تک لاؤڈ سپیکر کے بغیر نہ پہنچ سکے. اس لیے چند باتیں میں اس وقت تک جب تک وہ تشریف لاتے میں آپ سے عرض کروں گا. اگر بجلی کا یہ مسئلہ زیادہ لمبا رہا تو میں آپ دوستوں سے درخواست کروں گا, کیونکہ چھاؤں بھی اب آنے والی ہے, تو آپ ذرا اور نزدیک آ جائیں. اچھا بجلی آ گئی ہے. تو میں آپ دوستوں سے یہ عرض کر رہا تھا کہ ان کی ایک طویل جدوجہد ہے. یہ جب بھی کوئی کشمیری لیڈر یہاں سے لندن جاتا ہے, یہ ہاؤس آف لارڈز جو اس سے پہلے جیسا کہ دوستوں کو پتہ ہے جو ہماری تاریخ سے واقف ہے, جو برطانیہ کی اور ہندوستان کی تاریخ سے واقف ہے, ان کے لیے ہاؤس آف لارڈز یا ہاؤس آف کامنز ایک زمانے میں شجر ممنوع ہوتا تھا. وہاں کوئی آدمی جو اس خطے سے تعلق رکھتا ہے یا تیسری دنیا سے تعلق رکھتا ہے وہ وہاں نہیں جا سکتا تھا. لیکن آج ہمارے لیے ان دوستوں کے نتیجے میں یہ خوشی کا مقام ہے کہ آج جب ہم کشمیر کی بات کرنے لندن جاتے ہیں تو وہاں لارڈ ایوبری جیسے دوست, راجر گاڈسن جیسے دوست اور لارڈ ویدرل جیسے دوست ہمیں ریسیو کرتے ہیں, اور نہ صرف ریسیو کرتے ہیں بلکہ ہاؤس آف لارڈز کے جو کمیٹی رومز ہیں وہ ہماری میزبانی کے لیے یہ ہماری میزبانی وہاں کرتے ہیں, وہ ہمیں یہ وہاں مہیا کرتے ہیں تاکہ وہاں ہم کشمیر کے حوالے سے اپنی بات جو ہے وہاں کے عوام تک, وہاں کے جو ممبران پارلیمان ہیں ان تک اور وہاں کے میڈیا تک پہنچا سکیں. تو میں سمجھتا ہوں کہ یہ ان دوستوں کی قربانی کا نتیجہ ہے کہ وہاں ہمیں وہاں جو ہاؤس آف لارڈز ہے یا ہاؤس آف کامنز ہے وہاں کشمیریوں کو ایک نمائندگی کا حق ملتا ہے, اور یہ نمائندگی ہماری وہاں جو ہے ان دونوں ایوانوں میں کرتے ہیں. اور اسی طرح اس سے ہٹ کر جو ان کی قربانی ہے کہ جناب یہ دنیا کے مختلف فورمز میں دنیا میں مختلف جگہوں پر جاتے ہیں, چاہے وہ یو این سیکرٹری جنرل ہوں, جو اس سے پہلے سیکرٹری جنرل تھے بطرس غالی, اس کے پاس بھی لارڈ ایوبری کے ہمارے مسئلہ میں انہوں نے یہ مسئلہ ان کے پاس جا کر اٹھایا. اسی طرح ہر جگہ جہاں ان کو موقع ملتا ہے یہ وہاں جاتے ہیں. یہ 2 دن اسلام آباد میں رہے ہیں, وہاں صدر پاکستان, وزیر خارجہ پاکستان اور اسی طرح اسپیکر پاکستان نیشنل اسمبلی, سینٹ پاکستان, چیئرمین سینٹ پاکستان اور اسی طرح صدر آزاد جموں کشمیر, اور آج یہ وزیر اعظم صاحب کے خصوصی دعوت پر شام کو اسلام آباد میں ان کے زورانہ میں عشائیہ میں شامل ہوں گے. اور اسی طرح مختلف فورمز میں یہ گئے ہیں اور اپنی بات جو موجودہ صورتحال ہے اس حوالے سے بات کی ہے. ہم نے لارڈ ایوبری اس کے باوجود کہ صدر آزاد کشمیر کی دعوت پر یہاں آئے اور آزاد کشمیر اور پاکستان میں آئے, لیکن ہم نے ہر جماعت کا جو فورم ہے وہ ان کے لیے جو ہے وہ اوپن رکھا. ہم نے کہا جہاں بھی یہ جانا چاہیں, جس مکتبہ فکر سے یہ بات کرنا چاہیں کر سکتے ہیں. میں یہاں دوستوں سے معذرت خواہ ہوں جو دوست دوسری جماعتوں سے تعلق رکھتے ہیں کہ وقت کی قلت کی وجہ سے, کیونکہ انہوں نے واپس اسلام آباد اے پی ایس سی کی کانفرنس میں 3 بجے شریک ہونا ہے, اور کل موسم کی خرابی کی وجہ سے ہم یہاں دیر سے پہنچے. جو دوسری جماعت کے دوست ہیں, دوسری جماعتوں کے دوست ہیں, ہم ان سے معذرت یہ چاہیں گے وہ اگر کچھ بات اس کے بعد کچھ مختصر سی بات کرنا چاہیں لارڈ ایوبری سے تو ہم ان کو دعوت دیتے ہیں کہ وہ آئیں اور بات کریں, لیکن تفصیلاً بات کا موقع نہیں مل سکے گا کیونکہ واپس اسلام آباد پہنچنا ہے. البتہ اسلام آباد میں جس جماعت نے ان سے ٹائم دینا چاہا, جے کے ایل ایف نے خصوصی ٹائم مانگا, ہم نے ان کو دیا. مسلم کانفرنس کے شاہ غلام قادر صاحب تھے, اسی طرح اور دوست تھے, انہوں نے ان سے ٹائم لیا, انہوں نے دیا, اپنا نقطہ نظر وہاں پیش کیا. تو میں ان جماعتوں سے جن کو ہم یہاں الگ خصوصی وقت نہ دے سکے میں ان سے معذرت خواہ ہوں. میں آپ سب کا تہ دل سے مشکور ہوں کہ اس کے باوجود کل موسم بہت خراب تھا, بارش تھی, اور آج صبح بھی بارش کا
Lord Avebury, before I invite you on the stage, I would like to bring into your notice that today this meeting is also attended by the honorable members of Bar, the lawyers, and this is Sardar Nawaz Khan, who is presiding this meeting, and we have also the President of the Bar at your back, Sardar Farooq Ahmad Khan. So I couldn't bring it into your notice before. And now these are the people...
Those human rights violations have got to stop as a precondition of the success of the negotiations. आज़ादी और मसला को हल करने और कशीदे वो उस इलाके में जिस फौज ने अवाम पर कब्जा किया हुआ है, गासिब फौज है, ऑक्यूपेशन आर्मी, जब तक इंसानी हकूक की खिलाफ वर्जियों का शर्मनाक सिलसिला बंद नहीं होता, हिंदुस्तान की तरफ से जो मजालिम ढाए जाते हैं उनका सिलसिला बंद नहीं होता, जब तक हिंदुस्तान की फौज...
New technology, we hear every day the news of these murders, rapes and so on, which are occurring in the valley. We get that across the internet, the new form of electronic communications, on which the all-party Hurriyat Conference and many other individuals are placing every day details of the atrocities which are committed. So they're no longer a matter that the Indians can shield from the eyes of the world by refusing to allow any observers to enter the territory. But it is essential, if we are to believe in Indian good faith, that they should now agree to admit Amnesty International and the UN officials who are given the task by the Human Rights Commission of ascertaining what human rights violations are being perpetrated and reporting back to the world community. If the Indians refuse to admit Amnesty International, if they refuse to admit bona fide observers of human rights, then we must say that they're not acting in good faith on the security forces for the murders and other atrocities which they committed against the civilian population of Kashmir. It must be necessary as part of this process of confidence building that the Indians hold any trials of security forces members in public, and that the details of the trials which they say have already taken place, resulting in the conviction of some 270 members of the security forces, that the details of those trials also be made public, so that you can see whether the sentences imposed are in any way commensurate with the offences to which they're related. And we don't believe that can be so, because the number of convictions is tiny in relation to the vast mass of allegations which have been made over the years since the Intifada began in 1990, represented in these talks. The Indian National Human Rights Commission has recommended for 3 years past that their terms of reference should be amended so that they can investigate all human rights violations and not just a subset of them which excludes offences committed by the security forces in Jammu and Kashmir, and which also prevents them from taking evidence from witnesses to the crimes which have been committed there. And the example that I'd like to draw to your attention is that of the Bijbehara massacre, where some 50 people were killed by the Indian security forces, and a very thorough investigation was carried out by Chief Justice Bahauddin Farooqi, resulting in clear conclusions. The Indians, then feeling that it was necessary to show some realization of the enormity of this crime, asked the Indian Human Rights Commission to conduct its own inquiry. But when they did so, they could only take evidence from the government and not from any of the 72 witnesses who were interviewed by Chief Justice Bahauddin Farooqi. So it would be important that the National Human Rights Commission should have its terms of reference extended so that it can properly investigate all these crimes. Going to continue between the Foreign Secretaries of India and Pakistan, and of course the working groups to cover the subsidiary subjects mentioned in their communique. I believe that the omission of any reference to Kashmiri participation in the list doesn't mean any change in Pakistan's attitude, and that Pakistan will at some point insist that Kashmiris are brought into the picture and are allowed to express themselves. But I think it would be important that for the people of Azad Kashmir to make their own views plain on this, and to say that any solution which is arrived at over the heads of the people would not be acceptable and will be rejected if they have a chance of expressing themselves democratically. But then we come to the question of how you would select the participants for Kashmiri input into these discussions if that principle is agreed by both sides.
ये यहाँ की आवाम की किस्मत का फैसला होने वाला है और आवाम की किस्मत का फैसला आवाम से पूछे बगैर राय के इजहार का मौका दें। वो कहते हैं कि यहाँ के बारे में तो मुझे पता है फिर भी उठाएंगे। कहते हैं मेरे लिए असल दुश्वारी का मसला ये है कि हिंदुस्तानी मकबूजा कश्मीर के अवाम अपने नुमाइंदे किस तरह के।
You have democratic elections here, as we've been reminded, but they don't have any elections that can be called democratic on that side, and I'd like to just say a word or two about the so-called elections which were held last September and which brought Farooq Abdullah to the head of the puppet administration there. You know, in England, and I'm afraid probably even more so in the United States, people think that any election, however flawed, is better than none at all, and that whoever is brought to power by a process of rigged elections has to be treated as the legitimate expression of the people's will. They don't understand that where a large section of the community have been debarred from expressing their opinions and they have no candidate representing their point of view, then the elections can neither be described as free nor fair. Sustained by nearly 750,000 armed troops, he represents any section of the Kashmiri people. Or do you not think that he's been put there to do the will of the oppressors from outside the country? And therefore, if we are going to have Kashmiri representation at these future talks, it has to be clear that the people would not accept Farooq Abdullah as their representative, and that some other means have to be found of choosing legitimate and valid spokespersons for the Kashmiri people. But how can we do that if genuine elections are not held? Will there be nominations? Will they allow the members of the All Parties Hurriyat Conference to take part? And if so, how will they select representatives from Jammu or Ladakh? One is driven to the point of saying that only elections can be a way of providing these talks with the kind of representation of the Kashmiri people which really is meaningful and which will allow any bargain which is struck to be adhered to with the full assent of the people of the former state of Jammu and Kashmir, will allow the Kashmiri people to be truly represented at these talks. And I believe that it's time that all of us, whether the Kashmiri people in Azad Kashmir, the All Parties Hurriyat Conference in occupied Kashmir, or the friends and brothers of the Kashmiris in the international arena, are all making clear this message, that the talks must have the approval and assent of the people of Kashmir themselves. Now I want to conclude by saying that as far as I'm concerned, I'm committed to this struggle, and I'm going to continue working for the liberation of the Kashmiri people as long as there's a breath left in my body. I shall do everything I can within the United Kingdom Parliament, in collaboration with my colleagues, and particularly Roger Godsiff, who's already been mentioned, the chair of the Kashmir Committee in the House of Commons. I shall work to conscientise the members of the European Parliament, who I believe have an important role to play. I shall work with the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva, and I shall work to the extent that I can persuade them to listen with the Indians. I want to have a good relationship with the Indian authorities. I want to be able to visit Srinagar and speak to people there. And I regret very much that since Mr. Gujral came into power, and I wrote to him thinking that a change at the top would mean a change of thinking on the right of international observers to have access to Kashmir, that now would be the moment when I could seek an invitation. I believe that if the Indians don't allow genuine human rights observers, like the British Parliamentary Human Rights Group, to visit Kashmir, then you will not have the confidence building which these talks demand. But I assure you that whether we can visit Srinagar or not, we will continue to highlight the atrocities that occur there. We will not be put off by the threat that the talks may be jeopardized by anything we say, because it's not our references to the atrocities which jeopardize the talks, it is the atrocities themselves. And so we must all keep hard at it. We mustn't relax now that these talks have begun. We mustn't assume that success is going to be achieved in 10 minutes, but we're all in this for the long term, and however long it takes, we will continue the struggle until the whole of the state of Jammu and Kashmir is liberated.
हमारे होगी कि 50 साल पुराना मसला 10 मिनट की गुफ्तगू में हल हो जाए.
To have been called out of order, as it were, and I'm grateful to you for that privilege. I'm also glad that you've managed to hold this conference at such a well-timed moment, immediately after the meeting between the foreign secretaries, which we hope is going to lead to a just and lasting solution in accordance with the wishes of the people of Kashmir. Now, I think, if I may be permitted to express a view on the meeting of the foreign secretaries, that it was a useful beginning, but it needs an enormous amount of work to be built into something substantial and positive. And I say that because, first of all, there's no timescale attached to the remainder of the meetings. It's not like the data process where all the participants were brought together and meant to stay there until they reached a decision. Secondly, the question of the involvement of the Kashmiri people themselves in the formulation of a solution, which I notice is referred to in the letter from the Congressman, which you have before you, Mr. Rawalakot. I agree entirely with the sentiments that he expresses about the necessity of Kashmiri involvement in this new process. And thirdly, I believe it's essential, if the process is to be successful, that it is to be accompanied by a very considerable reduction, if not elimination, of the human rights violations which are still taking place and which are even now worse than ever in Jammu and Kashmir. I said to other audiences while I've been here this time, you can't arrive at a bargain with somebody in one room of your house whilst his thugs are beating up your relatives in the next door room. That's what it amounts to. That they're expecting Pakistan to sit down and reach these amicable agreements with them, whilst their brothers across the boundary in held Kashmir are being murdered, raped, looted, and driven out of their houses every day. And when I say every day, I mean that because now it's very difficult to stop the news from coming out of occupied Kashmir through new technology and the use of the internet. You can look at the stories which are emerging every single day and you know precisely what's going on. It's not easy for them to hide this. And although the Indian authorities are still not prepared to allow Amnesty International, the Parliamentary Human Rights Group, of which I had the honour to be chairman for the last 21 years, and I'm now vice chairman, the Kashmir Committee of the UK Parliament, and any other bona fide international organisation which is interested in the human rights of the Kashmiri people is not permitted to go there. But I did accompanied by a genuine reduction in human rights violations in the valley in particular. Secondly, I believe that this transparency must be accompanied by a greater willingness to reveal the details of prosecutions which they say have been organised against the violators of human rights in the valley, amounting to 270 convictions over the last years of the intifada. And first of all, I'd say that must be an absolutely tiny number in relation to the enormous mass of reported incidents that we receive all the time. And secondly, the sentences, of which we only have a statistical summary, don't bear any relation to the gravity of the offences. I believe that the largest sentence ever handed down to a member of the security forces in Indian Kashmir was 10 years imprisonment. So that for all the murders that have been committed, all the massacres, the greatest sentence that's ever been imposed is 10 years. And when you think of this in relation to events such as the Bihar massacre, in which 50 people perished at the hands of Indian guns, then you must say that they're not really in earnest in saying, as they did in order to persuade one human rights activist in the valley to come off a hunger strike recently, that they will investigate thoroughly through the appropriate agencies all allegations of human rights that are reported to them. And the National Human Rights Commission itself can't do that. They were invited specially as a one-off by the Indian authorities to investigate Bihar itself. But they were not able to visit the valley and to take evidence from the 72 witnesses who appeared before Chief Justice Bahauddin Farooqi. And they only relied on second-hand reports which they received from the Indian government. Neither did they investigate the two other large-scale massacres which occurred in the same year as Bihar in the town of Sabor. Nobody's ever looked into those events. And there are literally hundreds of similar cases which remain unchecked because the Indian authorities have denied access to genuine human rights observers. But now I want to come back for just a few minutes to the question of Kashmiri's involvement in the human rights, in the further talks that have been scheduled by the two foreign secretaries under the main headings of peace and security and confidence building measures as number one, and the question of Jammu and Kashmir number two. Now I think we must obviously clarify what the Indians understand by a discussion of Jammu and Kashmir, because we all read the statement that was made by the Foreign Secretary when he went back to New Delhi, that they were only prepared to discuss Azad Kashmir in the northern areas and not the parts of the territory which were occupied by his country. Now, I think that's an absurd interpretation of the words, and it can't be made to mean that. If you're talking about Jammu and Kashmir, you're speaking about the whole state, including Jammu, the valley, the Ladakh, and the northern areas, and Azad Kashmir on this side. You can't single out the bits that suit you and exclude the bits that suit the other party. If you're going to talk about Jammu and Kashmir, it has to be dealt with as a whole. And I think that the international community should bring pressure to bear on India to stand by the exact wording of this agreement and insist that they do not renege on the agreement so recently signed, but that they discuss frankly and openly the political future of the whole of the territory. Secondly, I think, with regard to these discussions, that maybe, and I heard the previous speaker talking about the working groups, some of these could be brought in to the main items. It's perhaps not entirely convenient to discuss Siachen separately from the question of Jammu and Kashmir. But that, however, is a detail. I think the most important thing, the crux of the whole matter, is that the whole issue of the future of Jammu and Kashmir must be dealt with at the further round of talks, which are to be held in September. My reservation on these further talks is that they'll continue at Foreign Secretary level and that they won't find some mechanism for involving the people themselves. How are they going to do that? treated as being a serious contribution towards a genuine political process, then what other means have they got of bringing representatives of the Kashmiri people to the talks? I'm sorry to say that a lot of people in Great Britain, and even more perhaps in the United States, think that any elections, however flawed, are better than none at all, and that people who come into office as a result of those processes have acquired thereby a degree of legitimacy which entitles them to be heard on the world stage. I reject that proposition, and I remind you of what happened in Zimbabwe, then called Rhodesia, in 1979, when the two nationalists, the nationalist parties under Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe, were excluded from the electoral process, and Bishop Avebury won a resounding victory with 67% of the votes. But then, after the Lancaster House meeting, when arrangements were made to bring the nationalists into the electoral forum, they swept Bishop Mugabe aside, and as you know, Robert Mugabe came in as the leader of the independent Zimbabwe, and Joshua Nkomo was his runner-up. Bishop Mugabe was nowhere to be seen. And I think that if people were permitted to stand in elections in occupied Kashmir, who represented all the possible constitutional changes that people would like to see there, the same thing would happen. That Mr. Farooq Abdullah would be eclipsed, and he would no longer be taken seriously on the political stage. So I think that we have to consider some alternative process by which these representative Kashmiris are brought to the talks. And the only way I know of doing that is by having proper elections in which people are able to vote for any kind of political settlement which they believe correct. That you would have people standing on the platform of independence, people would be standing on a platform of accession to Pakistan, and people would be standing on a platform of accession to India. And then the people would be able to choose between them how they wanted their representatives to speak for them at the talks which are going to continue. But you will immediately point out the Indians are not going to accept such a process because they'll say it amounts to a referendum in disguise. And I think we do have a major problem here in how we're going to bring people to the talks who can be treated as genuine representatives of the people. That all parties who are in conference has an important role to play here. The elected government in Azad Kashmir has an important role to play. But they don't represent the whole of the people of the former state. And some mechanism has to be discovered by which those remaining parts of the territory can be properly represented. I'm not going to try and spell this out today. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, nor have I been invited to participate in the process. But one word on that subject, because I saw that Mr. Derek, sorry, his name is our Minister of State at the Foreign Office, who deals with this region of the world, was Derek Cratchit. I know his name as well as my brother, who just went out of my mind. Derek Cratchit was here in New Delhi just the other day. He was offering his services to both parties to facilitate the process. Now, I believe that Pakistan has always been willing to accept the facilitation or the mediation of a third party. And there have been many offers in the past. I think our previous Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd made the offer at one time. The UN Secretary General has always said that he stands willing to come and help. In fact, the previous Secretary General, Dr. Boutros Ghali, said this to me personally when I went to talk to him about Kashmir. But he said, we can't do that unless both India and Pakistan want our good offices. Now, if you look around the rest of the world, where there are conflict situations and dangers to world peace arising from these internal conflicts, then in almost every single case that I can think of, they have found it helpful to bring in some third party. In our area of the world, we have the OSCE. They've been in Bosnia and in Chechnya, the problem of Chechnya, egging them on to accept these solutions. Why should the question of Kashmir be the only one throughout the whole world where outside advice and help is not thought to be useful? And I would put it to both sides, and I know that we've received a sympathetic hearing here in Islamabad, that you can't lose anything by it. If you accept the advice and wisdom of third parties, then you can incorporate their thinking in your final solution, or you can say, no, we have better ideas ourselves. They don't in any way inhibit the power of the parties to arrive at their own solutions completely independently, if that's within their power. But let me conclude by saying that I have been with you in the struggle for self-determination of Kashmir, I think almost since the beginning of the Intifada in 1990. I've attempted to do what I can with our own government and at the level of the United Nations and in Geneva at the Commission for Human Rights to draw the world's attention to these problems and to point to the dangers of allowing them to persist. I pledge myself here in front of you today that I will continue side by side with
Beside all these monasteries and stupas, three nations which is the second nation is Sikha, the third one is Sikha.
And that seems to be the largest.
This is the largest. So chronology starts from 6th century BC, when we have Median Empire. So then this city was then after the death so here is the stucco objects. You see there is the influence of the Indian. There is the right shoulder is there. So I wanted to show you the Greek picture. This is a presentation of 4 bowls. The rest of the body used to be called the like that. As it is. Sometimes people might destroy it. Dr. Dali disagreed with the argument of Sir John Marshall. So, Sir disaster is the statement of John Marshall. Because we excavated all these things. So it was buried under the ground. Masjid, Jammu Masjid. So we have the Quranic verses in every mosque. So it's just like that. Like a Hindu mosque.
But they have a lot of lots of art. The very reason for that is probably can be in different poses, like one that we were, the big one there, he's meditating, and he's like that. And then there's another image, which is like that, which is teaching.
the bomb was attacked by actually
These all are really this area after.
जो मशहूर तारीखी वाक़यात मिले ये बड़ी खास चीज़ जैसे में
economic communist system was so flawed they were going to collapse within their own system. That's the end of that transformation. But I agree that has helped to counter the extremism.
Did you go to India? No, LSE was up recently. Full time?
We hear so much about poverty there, a lot of refugees there, a lot of permanently residing on footpaths, letting new technology capital.
Thank you so much. Turn, but I want you to see
So you arrived for yesterday?
I arrived on Wednesday in Rawalakot and came back this afternoon. We had an exciting journey out there with some blockages of the road which had to be cleared on the way as a result of the heavy rains, but we made it and we had a very delightful stay in Rawalakot.
It's a beautiful place anyway.
Wonderful place, yes. And we had a very nice public meeting this morning, which was very well attended. So that was our stay in Jammu Kashmir. And I must tell you that we received some objections from people from Kosti. They said, why don't you come and visit us?
Yeah, I think now that Tony Blair is hoping to abolish the hereditary peerage, and Lord Avebury is likely to lose his seat. He's looking for a constituency in and the way he was addressing public gatherings and shaking hands and kissing babies is an idea. And I said, you better, so he went even to all parties in the youth conference. And so he's available to all political parties. And I'm here to negotiate the
transfer fee, yeah.
In fact, he travelled through my constituency and came back.
Yes, he was very keen to meet certain constituents. I said, unfortunately, they happen to be the voters at the constituency of Sardar Khalid Sahab.
We've got